Hi there, and welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. At Frontier, we know how hard keeping track of events in Myanmar can be, and this podcast features journalists and experts discussing some of the most consequential, convoluted, or just plain interesting stories about the events affecting the country today. It's Friday, February 21. And today, for episode 16, I'm delighted to invite fellow Australian Sean Turnell, Senior Fellow at the Lowy Institute in Sydney and advisor to the National League for Democracy, onto the show to talk about military financing. Welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, Sean.
Thank you, Luke. It's a pleasure.
Now, before we go into your new 36-page report, Sean, and the reason why you're here, please permit me a few minutes to go over the other big news of the week. Hot off the heels of our interview about the growing scam industry with the economist Su Lin Wong on the previous episode of this podcast, the scam compounds on the Thailand border have again dominated headlines this week. China's Assistant Minister for Public Security, Liu Zhongyi, has now visited Bangkok and the Thai-Myanmar border and given advice to Thailand ministers on cracking down on the scam centres. This included support to continue the ban on the supply of electricity, fuel and internet to border towns. Kayin State Border Guard Force leader Sittwe then said on Monday that his group will close cyber scam syndicates in its territory, including at KK Park and Sri Gogo, as the much-discussed Thailand arrest warrant for him still fails to materialise. Hundreds of Chinese nationals from scam compounds in Myawaddy are now in the process of being repatriated, and casinos and scam offices in Bayatongzu have reportedly paused operations or closed down. This is still a fast-moving story, and if you want to hear more about Thailand's efforts in particular to close the scam compounds, look for Frontier Myanmar's interview with opposition MP Rangsiman Rome, published online yesterday. Rangsiman boldly states in that interview that organised crime and corruption within Thailand enables the Myanmar scam compounds to survive. The link to the interview is in the show notes. And last weekend in Yangon, the military released over 900 Rohingya people from insane prison, most of whom were detained after the 2021 coup for breaching the strict movement restrictions placed on Rohingya people by the military's State Administration Council, or SAC. However, instead of being freed without condition, prisoners were quickly transported to Sittwe, where there's concern that some may be forcibly recruited by the military to fight against the Arakan Army, or AA. Only around 100 of the nearly 1,000 people were actually originally residents of Sittwe. Fighting continued on the edges of the city this week, with the AA shelling military positions and boats, and the military responding with airstrikes. And on the plight of the Rohingya elsewhere, at least 19 medical facilities serving Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar have suspended operations since the United States froze foreign aid last month. They account for roughly 15% of available facilities for the hundreds of thousands of refugees sheltering there. And of these, at least 70,000 people currently require care, according to Bangladesh's Refugee Relief and Repatriation Commissioner, Mohammed Mizanur Rahman. Organisations providing healthcare in the camps are staying tight-lipped, but one official involved claimed that facilities in the camp have scaled down their services by as much as 25% since the funding was paused, even if they haven't shut down entirely. And under the principle of universal jurisdiction, a court in Argentina issued international arrest warrants last week for Senior General and coup leader Minal Klein and 24 others for crimes committed against the Rohingya in 2017. Yes, those crimes that led to hundreds of thousands of Rohingya sheltering in Bangladesh and the growth of the camps just mentioned. The Argentinian court also issued warrants for detained state councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, who infamously refused to rebuke the military at the time of the atrocities, and ex-President Tin Jaw. Similar cases are ongoing against the Myanmar military in other countries, and at the International Court of Justice and International Criminal Court. The latter sought an arrest warrant for Min Aung Hlaing in November last year. And as covered in depth in Frontier Myanmar's daily briefing newsletter yesterday, which I remind you is available to Frontier members, the SAC has enacted its Private Security Service Law, allowing foreign companies to deploy private armed security personnel in Myanmar. It requires these personnel to, I quote, detain offenders who commit crimes in duty areas and hand them over to the police, as well as to, I quote, report to the nearest police station when he or she knows certain information that affects the state security and rules of law. Foreign security companies must also deposit the equivalent of 100 million Myanmar Kyat at the regime-controlled Myanmar Economic Bank to operate. The law was likely written with China in mind, given the many Chinese investments in Myanmar, the military's lack of control on the ground, and the fact that China has deployed security companies in many other countries. And of course, Chinese companies have long assisted the SAC with related CCTV, drone, and internet restricting technologies. Military airstrikes continued to kill and maim civilians this week. Last Friday, airstrikes hit 2 villages in Gali Township, killing 8 people, including a child, and injuring more than 10 others. Then on Monday, Air Force bombs killed 4 civilians and injured 8 more in the Yuinbo village of Myinjan Township, and at least 3 more were injured on the same day when bombs were dropped on Gani along the Chindwin River. Then on Wednesday, military bombs killed an entire family in Wangan village of Momelt Township, including 3 children under the age of 10. Apart from airstrikes killing civilians, the Ta'an National Liberation Army, or TNLA, was reported to have suffered heavy military casualties from airstrikes in Naochou this week, as ceasefire talks in Kunming between the Myanmar military and TNLA failed to result in agreement. The military has been pushing to retake Naochou for 3 months now. And coming to our guest, Sean. Last Friday, Frontier Myanmar published an interview with Chin National Front Vice Chair, Dr. Sui Kar, by journalist and Substack writer Lorcan Lovett, who's also a previous guest of this podcast. In the interview, Sui Kar was bullish, claiming the Myanmar military has failed in its attempts to bolster its army since the coup, and predicting more resistance victories in 2025. This includes liberating the whole of Chin State. While wary of the Arakan army's intentions there, he's optimistic about the split in the Chin resistance being healed once the military is dealt with. Sui Kar's general comments in this interview reflect what many in the resistance believe. The military is on its back foot, at its weakest in decades, after losing territory, natural resources, and border trade revenue since the coup. It faces a labour shortage, and it's conserving aviation fuel by increasingly relying on cheaper Y-12 transport planes and paramotors in its bombing campaigns. In this weakened state, its ability to fight, let alone govern, relies more than ever on its remaining revenue streams, and the military still has command over the nation's currency, its central bank, and other financial institutions. The role that other countries and multilateral institutions can play in increasing financial pressure on the military is the subject of a recent report by the Independent Special Advisory Council for Myanmar. Released on February 11, it's titled The Military, Money and Myanmar, Breaking the Nexus. Our guest today, Sean Turnell, of course, authored that report, and we are so lucky to have him here to break down some of the report's key recommendations for us. So, Sean, it's always good to start with a little bit of context, especially as the years go by now. It's been 4 years since the 2021 coup, and I should note 2 years since you were released from unjust imprisonment in Myanmar at the hands of the military. Before then, you had a front row seat to economic reform in the country. I want to ask you, in your view as an economist, what did the State Administration Council undo when it took over control of the government and reimposed what you call the economics of the quartermaster?
Yeah, that's right. Well, it really got rid of the market, the formal market, which is not to say the market doesn't exist. It does. but it's now informal. It's a black market again. And really, we've got the economy of the quartermaster, or another way we could put it, a war economy, a state-dominated war economy where the one objective is to get as much financial resources as possible to run the war. So it's got nothing to do with GDP, measures of welfare, measures of poverty, nutrition, education rates, nothing like that. It's all just very singular. How do we win the war? That's really the full measure of economic management, if you can call it that.
Yeah, and I think we've all seen the awful consequences of that. Now, your report highlights the importance of controlling foreign exchange to military rule and power in Myanmar. These are US dollars, Chinese renminbi, and Thai baht. But to a listener who might not be familiar with economics, or for someone who earnestly swallows military propaganda about economic self-reliance, could you explain why foreign exchange is crucial to Myanmar military dominance?
Yeah, foreign exchange is absolutely critical to military rule in Myanmar because economic management has been so bad over 70 years that Myanmar has very little in the way of an industrial base. So essentially for advanced weaponry of any form, but particularly air-delivered munitions, they need foreign exchange. So there's almost a direct correlation between the weapons the junta needs to win their war, in their mind, with foreign exchange. And so really it's all about controlling foreign exchange. For the regime, how do they get it? How do they extract it from people? Extract it out of the economy? And for the opposition and people who want to see the junta fall, how do we restrict their ability to access foreign exchange?
And the military uses both informal and formal methods to get foreign exchange. Could you explain some of the ways in which it does so?
Yeah, so there's two main ways. One is through earnings of state-owned enterprises. And the principal figure here, of course, is the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise. That's where the bulk of foreign exchange earnings of the Myanmar state, that's where that comes from. So they get a lot of foreign exchange from that. But they also get a lot of foreign exchange from basically being a parasite on the private sector. So the private sector of Burma is out there earning export revenues through rice, through garment manufacturing, through, used to be tourism, not much of that anymore, but that sort of thing. And what they've done effectively is bring in all sorts of surrender requirements on foreign exchange, a type of taxation, if you like, to try and extract that foreign exchange from the private sector. And then they give back to the private sector some very, very devalued jat in exchange. But they keep the hard currency because that's what they need to buy the advanced weaponry and munitions. So those two main ways, state enterprise earnings on the one hand, and then extraction out of the private sector on the other.
Right, and Myanmar's banks are really crucially important to this too. There's a bewildering array of banks in Myanmar, and in your report, there are all kinds of acronyms, the CBM, the MFTB, the MICB, the MEB. Could you help our listeners understand which are the most important of these? What do they do? Are they sanctioned or should they be sanctioned in your view, and why?
Yep, so the most obvious sources of foreign exchange in the banking system for the junta are the state-owned banks. So, and as you said, Luke, there's a blizzard of names and acronyms, etc. But the most important of them are the big state-owned banks, beginning with the central bank itself, the Central Bank of Myanmar, the Fed, if you like, of Myanmar. So that's number one. Then there's two other banks that up until now have been critical for foreign exchange earnings. Basically, the Burmese state has always used these two, and that's the Myanmar Foreign Trade Bank and the Myanmar Investment and Commercial Bank. Now, both of those banks have been subject to US sanctions. So there's been an absolute collapse in their economic activity. So they're not big earners of foreign exchange anymore. So where the action has shifted amongst the state-owned banks is towards another one called the Myanmar Economic Bank, or MEB, also state-owned. It's a little bit different to the other two because it does a lot of general banking as well. The MEB has got branches all over Myanmar. So it's a bit of a general bank that many ordinary people in Burma would use as well. But now it's become the principal vehicle for foreign exchange. But of course we know that, and so it's vulnerable. So it could be next to be sanctioned. So what the regime has done now is expanded beyond the state-owned banks, and now they're using the private banks as well, which is not hard because the regime can just lean on them. one of the things why banks are so vulnerable is for a bank to function, it has to be allowed to function. It's got to have a license. So it's very easy for any state to control its banks, frankly. So that's why, in a sense, the entire formal banking system is really up to the juntas to control if it wants to. So what we're seeing, apart from, as I say, this move towards the Myanmar Economic Bank, we're also seeing a move to some of the big private banks, and they're doing a lot of work for the junta overseas as well. So the whole banking system is potentially and largely corrupted by the junta even now.
So given that the military can just lean on one bank, then change to another, is this piecemeal approach to sanctions effective?
No, it's not. And it's a great question, mate. So it's a good way to start things off, in a sense, a piecemeal approach, because you're hoping things are going to return to normal. I think, there was an initial thought that the coup would just very quickly fall apart and, the civilian government return. So, but clearly that's not the case. And so what you're hinting at is really the answer, that the system itself has to be sanctioned. And the way to do that is essentially to go after the central bank, to actually declare the JAT itself and the access of JAT into foreign exchange prohibited. And so, in other words, the technical way you would do that would be to sanction the central bank, and you could also deny access of the private banks to an international banking messaging system called SWIFT. Now, we need to go into the details of that, but just to say, those are the nuclear options, if you like. Sanction the central bank and deny access of even the private banks to the SWIFT messaging system. And that way you actually close the system off, particularly accessing dollars and Western currencies.
So those are primary sanctions, but you also argue that secondary sanctions should be applied against anyone dealing with Myanmar's state-owned banks and the Ministry of Oil and Gas Enterprises. So what is a secondary sanction, and how can they possibly be enforced? If I understand them correctly, they sound very difficult to enforce.
They are very difficult, and as always with sanctions, it's about politics rather than the technical aspects. But secondary sanctions are needed at some point as well. This is a further option, if you like. So let's say you sanction the central bank, you deny access to the private banks to dollars, but you've always got perhaps some rogue banks, let's just say in China, for example, or somewhere like that, who are willing to break through that embargo and provide Myanmar with foreign exchange, and particularly, let's say, dollars. Well, essentially what a secondary sanction does is to say, well, look, a non-Burmese bank, and again, let's say a Chinese bank, if you give dollars to the Myanmar banking system, we'll sanction you. And so you effectively say to a Chinese bank or whatever country it's from, you say, look, you deal with Myanmar, you can do business there, or you do business with us, your choice. And 90% of the times, of course, such a bank would choose interactions with the US and the Western financial system rather than in Myanmar.
Gotcha. But let's not forget that sanctions are controversial in principle and in Myanmar over the last few decades, where people argue that they negatively contributed to the standard of living in the country and people suffering. So where do you come down historically on sanctions in Myanmar? And what could be done to mitigate the negative consequences of any new sanctions?
Yeah, it's a critical question. And of course, sanctions do have collateral damage, to use that dreadful expression, but they do harm people who are innocent. There's no question about that. On the other hand, if one was to say, who is the biggest sanctioner of Burma right now, then it's one man, Min Aung Hlaing. So the day he launched that coup, he wiped 20% of Burma's GDP. And, of course, that has never been recovered. And so GDP now is 50% below where trend should have it. So the level of destruction is extraordinary. And the extent to which Burma is now cut off from international economics, international finance, etc., is due to the military dictatorship. So just to say that overwhelmingly the biggest sanction took place immediately after the coup. Now, of course, then the other sanctions come in round the edges. But just to say that their impact is relatively insignificant in terms of the damage compared to that. But then you get to the question is, well, what are they for? How can they be effective? Because there will be costs, as we've acknowledged. So you then say, well, what can they do? Now, in the past, sanctions were often used to signal unhappiness with the regime, right? To say, you're sanctioned, you're bad, we want to send that signal. Now it's really got nothing to do with that. We know the regime is bad. They know they're bad. Labelling them as such won't make any difference. But what would make a difference is that issue that I mentioned right at the beginning. Foreign exchange is desperately needed by the junta to buy the weaponry. They don't buy anything else. They don't buy medicines. They don't buy in services to reform the economy. They buy weapons. So if sanctions can deny the regime the foreign exchange it needs to wage the wars, then I guess what I would argue is that that is a good thing, and that will get us quicker to the real solution, which of course is getting rid of this regime. So that'd be the sort of cost-benefit analysis I'd place on it. There would be costs. Again, in my assessment, they're much less than the other costs, particularly the other costs of just maintaining that regime. But they do have to be measured in terms of how quickly can they bring about the fall of the SAC junta, not in any sort of indulgent way that we signal our virtue and our unhappiness with the SAC.
Thank you, Sean. Okay, that's well described. And I think that pretty much covers the military side. But of course, in Myanmar's crisis, there are other sides. There's the Alternative National Unity Government, always seeking fundraising. There's, non-violent resistance to military rule, and there is the armed resistance movement. In your report, you make the point that the United States Federal Reserve actually froze $1 billion belonging to the government of Myanmar immediately after the 2021 coup. And you say that that money could be unlocked and somehow be made available to groups resisting military rule in Myanmar. Now, many listeners may have never even heard of this money. So how would that be possible? And where would you like to see that money go?
Yeah, so the first thing to say on that is a big congratulations to the US for doing this, by the way. So the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve moved with alacrity after the coup. Like literally a week after the coup, they're making sure the junta doesn't get its hands on these reserves, because the junta basically reached out to try to grab this money. And you can imagine $1 billion spent on even more weaponry, So wonderful that the Fed moved and that the Treasury moved in that way. Okay, but now the assets are frozen there in the accounts of the Federal Reserve of New York. So what can we do to them? They're nicely sitting there out of the hands of the SAC. Wonderful. But can we do something else? And here I'm really inspired by what's happened for Ukraine. Because in Ukraine, essentially, we've got a similar scenario. This time, it's actually a little bit more difficult, the Ukraine story, because what's happened in Ukraine is that it's Russian reserves that have been frozen. And what America and the EU has been trying to do is think of ways, creative ways, of using those seized reserves to help the Ukrainian opposition and help the reconstruction of Ukraine. So Burma's situation is a little bit easier at one level, right? Because the funds unambiguously belong to Burma, but we've got this illegitimate regime that's come along that's not recognised by anyone. So it's not like that these reserves, properly belong to the junta, because that junta, in fact, is not even recognised as a legitimate government. So they're sitting there. They could be used in the same way that I think the Ukrainian reserves are used for, which is to distribute them to the opposition, particularly for things like humanitarian access, but you could essentially go further than that. Now, there are still complications because people listening to this might be say, well, who do you give them to? Now, one argument would be the NUG and other parts of that government that come out of the elected parliament. I've actually received legal advice that is properly where they belong. But let's say you're uncomfortable with that. There would be other ways of doing it, and it's been employed internationally as well. So, for instance, in Afghanistan, what was set up was a sort of body that included members of the opposition, but also financial people to create what is in essence a sort of trust fund or a sovereign wealth fund that will then take submissions on the allocation of assets, etc. So, in other words, there's different ways you could do it. You could even do things like use the reserves to allow the NUG and the opposition to borrow, like you use the reserves as collateral, and they can issue their own bonds or their own debt instruments, raise money that way. You could more immediately allocate the profits on those reserves, because many of those reserves are in the form of US Treasury bonds, which earn interest, so there's income accruing. So you could do all sorts of things, and all of that will depend on just the legal arguments. And unfortunately, we could really go down into a rabbit hole on this one, just about where the funds come from. But in the end, it all comes down to politics. And I guess my message here is just to say that if the will's there, then the means are there, because we've been able to do it for Ukraine. We've been able to do it in Afghanistan, in Iran, in Venezuela, and other places. So the technical aspects are complex, but they're easily achievable if we decide that that's what we want to do. And so I'm really saying, look, this is what we want to do. The situation in Burma is as bad as any in the world, and we can actually help. And along the lines, by the way, help ourselves. It means, governments in the United States and elsewhere don't have to pay anything. We've got this issue, to do with aid and withdrawal of aid, etc. these days. Well, Burma's in a situation where it can actually fund this itself.
Right, and that line could be really important because I want to ask you, how do these funds get unlocked practically? As we know, the United States, the new administration there is in chaos. That country is in a period of great instability. So does it require presidential approval to access this money, or can it be done through bureaucracy?
Yeah, so it can come from an executive order of the US administration. It would have to be administered by the Federal Bank of New York. But again, the reality of the situation of an executive order would unlock those funds. I think it's quite a persuasive argument, in my opinion, for the Trump administration, because really, to me, it sends the signal that Burma is a self-reliant country. It doesn't need to rely on the charity of the US taxpayer. It's a country, I think, in my experience, they're very well disposed to the United States. Most Myanmar people who I know have great reservations about China and feared it, and have always feared it. I think, China's behaviour since the coup would back that up. So it would create, I think, an entity or allow an entity that is naturally very inclined towards the US to, use their own funds. Likewise, I think much of the humanitarian resources that the funds would be used for could be purchased in the United States. I mean, these assets are US dollars. It costs more to convert them into other currencies. There'd be much equipment, much of the humanitarian access, and again, other things as well, military and otherwise, for which US dollars and the US would be the natural market. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's a good argument, it seems to me, for the Trump administration about why the release of these reserves would be good for Myanmar, but also very good for the United States and I think for the world as a whole.
Well, let's hope the persuasive arguments still work in Washington. Now, the next question is about multilateral institutions. You say in the report that the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Asian Development Bank, that they should support and cooperate with the national unity government. So how could that happen in practice? Is there any low-hanging fruit that they could go for?
I think this is a very simple one, actually, because thankfully the multilateral institutions you mentioned, IMF, World Bank, ADB, etc., they all suspended their activities in Myanmar the day after the coup, and that's continued, which again, big congratulations to them on that. But there's more that they can do, and they can help on the technical side, the opposition. Like, for instance, if these reserves were released, I would see a very strong role for all of those institutions, just, again, depending on what we need to create, etc. But also, I don't even need to think in theory about this because it's been done before. If I go back to the period before the reforms sort of began in the 2010s, and again, big congratulations for doing so, but the World Bank and ADB and IMF, they had reached out at that point to the opposition. They wanted to know the real situation. They wanted to know how they could be really helpful come the day that, freedom would come back to Myanmar. And it seems to me that once again, they're in that position. This would not even remotely be costly or anything. Many of those institutions we mentioned monitor Burma even now, that they keep their hand in, trying to work out what's going on, etc. So it really wouldn't involve much in the way of financial resources at all. But it would, I think, give a leg up not only to the opposition in Burma and what it might do in the future, but the multilaterals themselves, because at some point they will go back to Burma, and it'll be great for them to be working with the very people who will be trying to rebuild the economy. So, yeah, it seems to me that it's a win all round, that one.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Well put. Now, moving away a bit from the West and these big institutions, regional countries, Singapore. You mentioned in the report that Singaporean banks have stepped back a bit from working with the Myanmar military, but Singapore still remains the largest foreign investor in Myanmar, with the caveat that we don't really know how much China is investing. So, what's behind Singaporean foreign investment after the coup? Can it be done ethically, or is it covering up something more?
It's really interesting on this one. So the good news has been the pullback of Singapore banks in particular. On the other issue, though, which is a great question about the money that goes from Singapore into Myanmar, what's really interesting about that, it looks like Singaporean investment, but mostly it's not. Mostly it's Myanmar. Actually, it's Myanmar funds that have been put out there by various crony enterprises in Myanmar down the years who hold these offshore accounts. So in a sense, a lot of this is round tripping. Now, if those sanctions that I mentioned were put in place, that would come to an end. So that again would be a virtue of that. But yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon, this one. It's why we always have to be careful of the numbers of flows that move in and out from different countries, because sometimes it can actually disguise the real origin of those funds. And this one's a classic example. For instance, another one that comes up all the time is that it looks like Britain is a very big investor in Myanmar, because the British Virgin Islands always comes up really highly. But of course, the money from the British Virgin Islands is not British money at all. It's mostly Chinese money. In fact, it's mostly money from the Chinese state and state-owned enterprises, again, round-tripping through the British Virgin Islands to disguise the origins of these funds. So, yeah, it's a really interesting question, that, but a lot of it would be addressed by the sort of sanctions that I'm talking about.
Okay, Sean, thanks. That's important. And now moving from Singapore to China, that country has made it clearer and clearer since the 2021 coup that actually China is the most important country in determining political outcomes in Myanmar, and until now, they don't appear to want regime change in central Myanmar. So can that ever change? In your view, how could China be more constructively engaged in turning the economic trajectory of Myanmar around? Of eliminating poverty, maintaining peace. How do you see China's role?
I think China can play a much more constructive role. One of the sort of truisms we get all the time, right, is that China thinks in the long term and the West short term, etc. But it seems to me in Myanmar, it's exactly the opposite. China is thinking short term. It's thinking we've got to do a deal with these SAC junta guys because we've got all these Belt and Road Initiative investments and other things. Quick, let's try and keep them in place as long as possible. Where I think that's such a problem. Firstly, I think the SAC junta is on the way out. It's incredibly shaky. But China's support for the SAC junta makes China incredibly unpopular. Now, I don't have the scientific numbers on this, but it seems to me that China is probably the least popular country in Myanmar, and it has been for a long time, I think. So a long-term view would say, okay, we know China's always going to be the dominant investor in Myanmar. We know that, Chinese investment is often just about profits and, all the rest of it. But what is the long-term way of yielding that, of maximising that? Now, it's having a stable Myanmar, basically. It's not a war-ridden Myanmar. So, because when we think about it, like in things like the BRI, we know that this SAC junta is much more supportive of the big Belt and Road projects. So things like Jiaopu, the big deep-sea port and pipelines and all that, in theory, are now possible again under the SAC junta. But of course, in practice, they're not, because the junta has no control over the very space that these pipelines and the port has to be built. So China, in fact, doesn't get what it wants by supporting this junta. And yeah, to me, the medium-long-term bet on China is not with the SAC junta. Surely it is about a Myanmar that's going to be stable there for the long term. Myanmar as a long-term partner and as a friendly partner, etc. A sort of oppressed Myanmar that's unstable and where everyone sees China as an exploiter. That's not a win for China, it seems to me.
Good. Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it, Sean. Now, finishing up, last question. We've discussed a lot about, your report focuses on the financing of the military here and now and how to make change, but it also substantially discusses the future, right? Once the military is enfeebled or diminished or comes to some kind of a political settlement and the Myanmar nation is again potentially reconfigured. At that time, in your view, what are the most important economic policies, priorities that would best contribute to a more lasting peace in Myanmar and prosperity?
I think absolutely number one, get the military out of the economy. Once and for all. We know that there will need to be constitutional change. And part of that has got to be to outlaw the military having any involvement in the economy or having discretionary power over its own budget. I call that, by the way, the original sin of economic policy making in Myanmar, that the military has been able to dictate the money that it gets, which then makes chaos, basically, all other macro planning. You can't plan a budget. You can't control inflation. You can't stabilise the exchange rate if the military at any time can extract whatever it wants. So that's actually, funnily enough, number one. Once you've got that in place, then you can bring in the sensible economic policies, open the markets up, get some of the more absurd regulations. And we really are, the level of state involvement now under the military is just off the scale. So those sorts of reforms come in, and then, we get a bit of economic growth, and then hopefully get into a sort of virtual circle of more growth, more reform, and a society, if you like, that's more receptive for reform, in which investment takes place. People can invest in their kids. We get a better education system, health system, all that, and you get on that path to growth. But I think it's got to begin by getting the military completely out of the economy and without any ability to influence overall economic outcomes.
Well, there it is, boldly put. Thank you, Sean, for that reminder and your closing words. Thank you again also for coming on to the show on what was episode 16. All the best.
Thank you, Luke. It's been a bigger pleasure than I even expected.
Terrific, Sean. And to our listeners, for any of you that are not familiar, we didn't touch on it in a major way in this interview, but Sean Turnell, on top of being an economist of Myanmar, long-standing, was also imprisoned by the Myanmar military after the 2021 coup for nearly 2 years. And he has published a memoir, An Unlikely Prisoner, How an Eternal Optimist Found Hope in Myanmar's Most Notorious Jail, which was published by Penguin just over a year ago. So if you haven't read it, go and check it out. Sean was wrapped up in the trial of Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and also met Frontier Myanmar's own Danny Fenster in his time in the prison system. You can find links to Sean's many publications in the show notes under this episode. That takes us to the end of another episode of What's Happening in Myanmar. So thank you so much for tuning in and listening. Remember, you can send feedback to whimyanmar@proton.me, and we love to hear from you. In the coming weeks, we will be launching a listener survey where you can provide more concrete input into what you would like to hear from this show going forward. But for another week, let me say farewell and take care.